Welcome to True Crime Threads, where we unravel the dark and twisted stories hidden beneath the surface. In today's case, a girl's tragic death exposes a chilling web of betrayal and corruption. Leah had always been a quiet girl, someone who blended into the background of her small town. At 16, she kept to herself, not wanting to draw attention to her troubled home life. Her classmates didn't know much about her, and she preferred it that way. She kept her emotions hidden, the constant fear of what might happen next lurking just beneath the surface. The strained relationship she had with her mother, Sandra, was something she tried to bury, but it always found a way to surface. Sandra wasn't a typical mother. She had her moments of cold indifference and often vanished for days, returning with no explanation, her eyes bloodshot from drinking. She would occasionally lash out in fits of rage, and Leah learned early on that the safest option was to stay out of her way. But there was something darker that Leah never fully understood. Sandra had always been secretive about her past, rarely speaking of her life before Leah was born. One evening, as Leah sat in her room doing her homework, she heard Sandra speaking in low tones to someone on the phone. The conversation seemed normal at first until Leah heard the words that made her freeze in place. Sandra was talking to Sheriff Thomas, the man who was respected by everyone in town. He was the one everyone trusted, the man who kept the peace. But what Leah overheard shattered everything she thought she knew about her life. Leah pressed her ear against the door, trying to make sense of what she was hearing. She caught the words clearly. "This time I'll bring her over tomorrow night." Sandra's voice was calm, almost as if she were negotiating a business deal. Then Sheriff Thomas's voice, firm and calculating, came through. "You'll get what we agreed on. Everything will be in place." At first, Leah couldn't comprehend what was happening. But as the conversation continued, it became clear. Sandra was selling her daughter to Sheriff Thomas. The realization hit Leah like a physical blow, her heart racing as the words sunk in. Her mother, the woman who was supposed to protect her, had traded her to the sheriff in exchange for favors. The trust she had in her mother and the respect she had for the sheriff crumbled in an instant. Her world shattered as she realized just how little control she had over her own life. The pain and anger swirled within her, and Leah knew she couldn't stay silent anymore. She had to expose the truth. But in doing so, she would be risking everything: the safety she had clung to, the semblance of normalcy that had kept her going. She wasn't sure how to take that first step, but one thing was clear: her life would never be the same again. Leah's mind raced as she grappled with the horrifying truth she had just uncovered. She couldn't stay silent about what she had heard, but the fear of what could happen next paralyzed her. Her mother, Sandra, was not someone to cross, and Sheriff Thomas was a figure of power and influence in the town. Leah had always felt like an outsider, someone too insignificant to matter, but now everything had changed. She wasn't just a teenager in a dysfunctional home, she was a pawn in a twisted game, and the truth about what had been done to her could destroy everything. Leah spent the next few days in a daze, barely able to concentrate at school. The weight of the secret was unbearable, but she knew she had to find someone she could trust. The only person who had ever shown her any kindness was Isabella, a girl from her class who had always been friendly to her. Isabella didn't know about Leah's home life, but they had shared quiet moments together, offering each other small gestures of friendship. Leah had to tell her everything, even if it meant risking their friendship. One afternoon, Leah met Isabella in the school courtyard after classes. She felt the need to speak quickly, before anyone could notice them talking. With a trembling hand, Leah handed her a crumpled letter, the words on the paper heavy with the truth she had been too terrified to speak aloud. It detailed everything: how Sandra had sold her to Sheriff Thomas, how she had been treated like an object, used for whatever the sheriff wanted in exchange for favors. The letter was Leah's only hope of escaping the nightmare, but it was also a confession that would change everything. Isabella looked at her, her expression a mixture of shock and concern. Leah felt exposed, vulnerable, but she had no choice. She couldn't carry this burden alone anymore. She explained to Isabella that the sheriff had been using his power to control her, and that her mother was complicit in it. Her heart pounded as she finished the explanation, praying that Isabella wouldn't reject her or turn away. Isabella didn't say much at first, but Leah could see the horror in her eyes. After a long pause, she nodded and promised to help, though Leah could see the uncertainty there too. She wasn't sure how to proceed, but she knew one thing: she couldn't keep this secret anymore. The truth had to come out. But as Leah watched Isabella walk away, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just set something in motion that would lead to even more danger. The wait for the truth to unfold felt like an eternity. Leah spent sleepless nights, her mind racing with the thought of what could happen if Sheriff Thomas found out she was going to expose him. She had no idea what he was capable of, but she knew it wouldn't end well. Leah's decision to expose her mother's betrayal had set something in motion that she couldn't stop. As the letter detailing everything about her abuse made its way into the hands of the police, Sheriff Thomas became aware of the accusations against him. The small town buzzed with whispers, but Sheriff Thomas, always calm and composed, quickly went into damage control mode. He wasn't just a sheriff, he was an institution in the town. Everyone respected him, trusted him, and the thought of a teenage girl accusing him of such a horrific act threatened to destroy everything he had built. Thomas immediately began to cover his tracks. He reached out to Sandra, warning her that the situation was spiraling out of control. Together, they hatched a plan to discredit Leah. He knew that if people started to believe her story, his career would be over. The power he held in the town was at stake, and Sheriff Thomas would do anything to protect it. His mind worked quickly, and soon rumors began to spread, casting doubt on Leah's character. They painted her as a troubled, attention-seeking girl who had fabricated the entire story. They even went as far as having a few of Leah's classmates speak out, claiming that she had always been distant and had a history of making up stories. As these lies spread, Leah felt the walls closing in around her. She had expected resistance, but the force with which Sheriff Thomas and Sandra went after her left her feeling isolated and vulnerable. The truth she had tried to expose was now being buried under layers of manipulation and deceit. But Sheriff Thomas wasn't done yet. He took more drastic measures to protect himself. He started to threaten those who dared investigate further. Officers who had once looked up to him began to question what they were hearing, but the sheriff made it clear that their careers would be on the line if they pursued the matter. He even had allies in the local press who started to question the legitimacy of the investigation. The town, once full of suspicion, now seemed to support Sheriff Thomas's version of events. The more Leah tried to push the truth forward, the harder it became. Despite the mounting pressure, there were still small cracks in Sheriff Thomas's carefully constructed facade. Investigators, even under his influence, began to dig into his past, uncovering evidence that suggested his relationship with Sandra wasn't just professional. A trail of incriminating details began to emerge, linking Thomas to several other questionable activities. But before the investigation could fully take shape, tragedy struck. Leah's desperate attempt to expose the truth was interrupted by a brutal act that no one saw coming. The small town's darkest secrets were about to be sealed with even more blood. One evening, as Leah walked home from school, her heart raced with the weight of everything that had transpired. She had spent days trying to brace herself for the fallout, knowing that Sheriff Thomas would stop at nothing to protect his secret. Her steps quickened, but an overwhelming sense of dread settled over her. The streets, once familiar and comforting, now felt foreign, as if danger lurked in every corner. The truth she had tried to expose seemed to close in on her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before someone came to silence her. As she passed a darkened alley, Leah suddenly felt a hand grab her from behind. She gasped, struggling to break free, but the grip was too strong. The figure yanked her into the shadows, her body slamming against the cold, brick wall. Her mind went into overdrive as she fought to scream, to escape, but her voice was caught in her throat. In the dim light, she could make out the figure looming above her, his face partially obscured by the shadows. It was Sheriff Thomas. Fear surged through her veins as she realized what was happening. He had come for her, to stop her from revealing the truth. Leah's body shook, her heart hammering in her chest, but she refused to let him see her fear. She tried to push him off, but he was too strong, his rage evident in the way he gripped her. His words were cold and calculated, but Leah couldn't make out what he was saying. All she could hear was the pounding of her own heart, drowning out everything else. With each violent blow, Leah's body grew weaker. Sheriff Thomas seemed determined to make her pay for what she had done. His fists came down relentlessly, hitting her with a fury that seemed endless. The pain was overwhelming, but Leah kept her focus, her thoughts racing. She had to survive, had to keep fighting. But the blows kept coming, each one harder than the last, and her strength slowly drained away. Her body grew limp, and her vision blurred as the world around her faded into darkness. As the sheriff stood over her, breathing heavily, his face twisted with anger, Leah's thoughts were consumed with regret. She had hoped that by exposing the truth, she could free herself and others from the grip of the sheriff's corruption. But now it seemed that the price for her courage was her life. The sheriff's face was the last thing she saw before everything went black, her body crumpling to the ground, a broken victim of the town's darkest secret. It was a brutal, senseless act that would leave the town reeling, and Leah's death would mark the beginning of a larger reckoning, one that would take more than just a tragedy to silence. The discovery of Leah's lifeless body sent shockwaves through the town. The once peaceful community, where everyone knew each other, was now consumed by fear, suspicion, and disbelief. No one could fathom how such a tragedy had occurred, especially to someone so young, so full of potential. The police were quick to respond, but even they seemed unsettled by the brutality of the crime. There was no doubt that the girl had been murdered, but the question that lingered was who could have done such a thing. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Sheriff Thomas was at the center of the web. The rumors that had swirled about his connection to Sandra, Leah's mother, were now taking on a darker meaning. People began to question the sheriff's involvement in Leah's life, wondering how deep his ties to Sandra went, and whether his relationship with her had gone beyond professional. But Sheriff Thomas was a master of control. He had built his reputation on trust, and many in the town were still hesitant to believe that he could be capable of such violence. Despite his efforts to shift suspicion, the evidence began to mount against him. Leah's letter had surfaced, and though the authorities initially dismissed it, they now had no choice but to investigate the claims it contained. The town started to see the true extent of the corruption that had festered beneath the surface for so long. It wasn't just about a single act of betrayal, it was about the power that Sheriff Thomas had wielded over people's lives and how far he was willing to go to protect himself. As the investigation gained momentum, Isabella, who had been Leah's only true friend, became a key witness. She had been the one Leah entrusted with the letter that exposed everything, and she felt a deep responsibility to make sure Leah's death wasn't in vain. She went to the media, revealing the truth about what had happened, despite the risks involved. Her courage sparked a fire in the town, and soon others began to speak up, sharing their stories of how Sheriff Thomas had manipulated and controlled those under his authority. The public outcry grew louder, and the pressure on the authorities to act became impossible to ignore. Eventually, Sheriff Thomas was arrested, charged with murder, and other crimes related to his abuse of power. Sandra was also arrested for her role in the exploitation of her daughter. But for Leah, it was too late. She had been silenced before she could see justice done. The town would never forget the girl who had tried to expose the truth, even if it cost her everything. Her death served as a tragic reminder of the darkness that could hide behind closed doors, and how sometimes the bravest among us are the ones who pay the highest price.